This more elaborate figure, likewise on a steel plate, is also produced by vibration. The exciting crystal is attached to the upper corner of the plate. We use sand and lycopodium. The lycopodium moves to the center of the fields and takes up circular shapes. The sand forms the lines. Each material has its own special way of behaving. Lycopodium alone, a sonorous figure, transition to a mobile flowing phase, and back again to the figure. The sonorous figures represent stationary waves. But now we can also observe moving waves. Here, the sand is flowing in a current. When the wavelengths are short, these currents produce a rotary effect. Areas become defined in which the particles are actually rotating. Now we produce two notes with frequencies which are so related as to cause a beat. The note seems to throb, and by using the method we have chosen, this phenomenon of beat or interference can be rendered visible. The figure sways to and fro, the figure pulsates. The picture has changed completely. Now we are exciting fluids. Under vibration, a layer of turpentine forms a regular lattice work. In vibrating glycerin, we see continuous waves which form the queerest figures. And yet, the extraordinary things we see here are simply and solely the effect of vibration.
Yo. Test, 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing is.
Here is a sonorous figure shown in a fluid. There are some wave fields where there was nothing before. Where there was previously sand, now there is nothing to be seen. The dynamic phase has become the static phase. Wave fields which make the vibratory process in the plate indirectly visible. Here again, interference can be demonstrated. All these wave fields pulsate. Interference becomes visible. A fluid colored black is dripped into a transparent fluid. Vibration now gives rise to curious eddy formations. It is always a pair of eddies that is created. One pair after another is generated so that we finish up with a whole series of such pairs of eddies in a symmetrical arrangement. The formation of these eddies by vibration is particularly significant because it is eddies of this kind which are specifically formed in the cochlea of our ears whenever we hear sounds. That is to say, they are not ordinary eddies as defined in rheology, but vibratory eddies, with the members of each pair turning in opposite directions. Plastic substance. A plasticizable substance is always shaped into a ball by the wave trains of the vibrating membrane. The masses are jiggled round, but gradually proper spherical shapes are formed, created by nothing more than the vibratory process. The human voice can also be made visible with a simple apparatus. The various vowels show typical characteristics depending on the nature of their sound. We can see the spectrum, as it were, of the sounds. A sequence of sung notes comes out as a sequence of vibratory patterns. We can see a melody. Music can also be made visible. The same membrane that emits the music can also make its vibratory processes visible through the medium of a fluid. Here we have the last 89 bars of the first movement of Mozart's Jupiter Symphony. We can see Mozart while we hear him. Lycopodium powder, the spores of the club moss, reveals a number of quite remarkable phenomena when made to vibrate. Circular shapes appear, but these are in a state of continuous upheaval. The particles are pushed outwards from the center and inwards again from the outside, and at the same time they pulsate. We can recognize the various patterns of the vibratory fields. They move to and fro, unite, and separate again according to the vibratory state of the surface formed by the membrane. And we can, as it were, move over a landscape which is in a state of vibration. If we intensify the note, if we produce a crescendo for the ear, the masses are hurled outwards. We see fountains, eruptions, explosions almost. But invariably, the particles return to the center, so that here again, even under these violently dynamic conditions, we find there is circulation. Here, a quick glance at a phenomenon with no vibration. Two liquids which spread by surface tension. No vibration is involved, but this phenomenon also progresses periodically, expressing the ubiquitous law of periodicity. Now we excite the surface on which the liquids are running. An entirely different picture is produced. It is even possible to make out a circular formation. Now there is vibration. But then the vibration slowly ceases, and again we see a phenomenon without vibration. The regular pulsation of these spreading masses of fluid. The behavior of iron filings, when subjected simultaneously to a magnetic field and emission, shows that adhesion to the surface is substantially reduced. The magnetic lines of the force round the poles show up with exceptional clarity. If we cluster the magnetic lines together, we can see the effect on the patterns formed. If we thin out the lines of force, the phenomenon spreads out. Because of the reduced adhesion, the particles of iron have certain degrees of freedom. They can move, fall into line, form figures, and almost dance, but only in obedience to the vibration imposed. Even these serpent-like formations are produced simply and solely by vibration over areas of the vibrating membrane representing movement processes. materials and substances and the various states of aggregation behave in characteristic ways under the effect of vibration, or we can say that their behavior is specific. Here is a pulp. Here again, round shapes are formed, and circulation is set in motion, but in the opposite direction to that observed with lycopodium. There is a definite ripple effect caused by the wave trains in the vibrating membrane, a rich field of effects due to vibration. They join together, separate, and pulsate. If we intensify the vibration, equivalent to a crescendo for the ear, the masses are thrown into ever greater agitation. They are ejected, spikes are thrust up, there are eruptions, protuberances appear, and all due to the dynamics of vibration. A whole landscape opens before us. The note we hear is strong enough to originate all this turbulence, this impressive display. And, to end with, here, by way of contrast, is a sonorous figure, a static figure instead of a dynamic one, representing the opposite pole in the vast range of phenomena that make up the world of vibration.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Goldman, founder and director of New England Sound Healers, a nonprofit organization dedicated to research and awareness of the use of sound and music for well-being. My guest is Dr. Peter Guy Manners. Peter Guy Manners is a doctor from England. He holds a number of different degrees, including Doctor of Medicine, Doctor of Osteopathy, as well as PhDs from both Oxford and Heidelberg University. He has researched and worked with Dr. Hans Jenin of Bâle, Switzerland, Professor Gaveau of the Sorbonne in Paris, France, Dr. Brunner of Heidelberg, Germany, and George Delaware at the Delaware Laboratories in Oxford, England. Since 1961, Dr. Manners has been applying his knowledge of the effects of sound for healing into the development of cymatics, which is now internationally known and used in various parts of the globe. His Bretforton Hall Clinic in Worcestershire, England, specializes in the use of cymatic therapy, the direct application of sound on the body for healing. Dr. Manners, it is a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Johnson. It's very nice to be back here, too.
Well, I wonder if you could tell us what exactly is cymatics? That is it a new form of therapy, or is it something that is very ancient, very old? What can you tell us about it?
Well, basically, it is not something which is new. It has been researched over a long period of time. A lot of research has gone into the work, and it has been in use for approximately 20 years in our clinic in Worcestershire. But over and above that, you ask, is it very old? Yes, it is very old. The concept of sound or music or any of these type of things is as old practically as man himself. But in cymatic therapy, we have adapted it into the modern idiom, and now it is used in a technological way, which is scientifically approved, medically acceptable, and is in use in many clinics throughout the world.
Is there some sort of history of the use of sound or music being used in ancient civilizations? I've heard that stories of this type of...
Oh yes, many of them. We have worked in the research field, and in order to work in the research field, you have to go backwards as well as forward. And we've traveled into many countries examining the techniques anywhere where there's been any suggestion that sound of any type was used. We found great evidence of that amongst the American Indians, where they used sound and vibration to heal the sick. In Greece, in Egypt, in China, in Mexico, in Brazil, in practically all the countries it has been used. Also in biblical times, of course, music and the formation of sound into a music form was used with very great success, and you'll find great evidence of this in your Bible.
The Bible, how so?
There are many references to calming the savage beast with music, and also we all remember the story of King Saul and the harpist that he always had to relieve his tension, his stress, and his strain.
Young David, I believe it was.
Precisely.
Yes, indeed. Pythagoras, who we know as the father of geometry, was also involved in this work. Is that true? Or,
Yes, that's perfectly true. But also the temples of Delphi. We have discovered comparatively recently that music and sound was one of the concepts of their healing technique. A lot of the stories which have been written concerning the temples of Delphi are not wholly correct. And we found that the pulsation of beating notes and music was one of the therapies which they used.
Fascinating, fascinating. Now, is cymatic therapy, what is it though? Is it sound? Is it music? Is it something you play from a tape recorder? Is it...
Well, of course, when you refer to sound, everyone sort of associates it with something that you listen to. With cymatics, this is not precisely so. It is literally the transplanting or the transmutation of accepted frequencies of sound into the tissue and structure of the human being. All areas of the body, all the organs of the body produce a harmonic, a sound. This sound is very small and very minute. This again is not a new concept, not a new theory, but it is only in comparatively recent years that technology has caught up with the concepts and the ideas of this, and we've been able to reproduce these frequencies and sounds. And now we can reproduce them, create them artificially, and transfer them back into the tissue and the structure. A lot of our doctors are referring it to transplant, because technically, I suppose this is what we are doing. We are transplanting the corrected frequencies back into the structure to replace any abnormalities that exist there. Also, of course, one of the strongest points which we advocate is that we can use this in place of drugs and medicine. And if we can replace medicine with treatment, we find this is much better. It takes a little more time, and you have to have a little more attention from your individual practitioner or your doctor. But then that is one of the things which we are trying to push forward at the present moment. that the medical profession treats every individual as a holistic being rather than a condition.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that there are different frequencies for different parts of the body, and that with cymatic therapy, you would somehow inject or put in the correct frequency that is needed for that part of the body. Is that correct?
That's correct. You see, every part of the body possesses a harmonic, whether it's the harmonic of the heart, the lungs, the liver, the kidney, muscles, bones, nerves, whatever it is, it produces a harmonic. This harmonic is now tabulated, we know what they are, and we can reform these artificially on a computer. Mm-hmm. Then it can be played back into the structure and the system. It is pleasant, it is easy, it is comfortable, there's no side effects. There are literally no conditions where it cannot be used, except if the patient has a heart pacer, but then that applies to all techniques of treatment if the patient has a heart beat problem there. But other than that, there are no conditions that can't be treated. Even in pregnancy cases, we've treated them right up to the time of delivery.
Mm-hmm. Now, cymatics, what does the word mean?
Well, in its early stages, which was now over 20 years ago, it was called sonic medicine or sonic therapy. Mm-hmm. But the general public got this confused with ultrasonics, which is quite understandable. So therefore we changed the name to cymatics. Cymatics is a Greek word meaning pressure or waves. While we are using pressure waves combined with the sound, so it's perfectly technically correct. Also, it pays tribute to one of the doctors whose groundwork formulated this concept and this therapy, and this was Dr. Hans Jenin of Bâle in Switzerland. And he called his form of research cymatic research. He did invaluable work. But what we have done is to bring the research of various physicists and doctors and scientists together, the list that you've already quoted, bring those together, and out of that we have evolved a technique of treatment which is now internationally known and is used right throughout the world.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Jenin's work has been published in a couple of books.
That's correct. There are 2 books which are beautifully illustrated and shows the formation of shapes and forms that can be created by various frequencies of sound. He lectured very, very little. He objected to standing on a platform and lecturing, but he did make records of all his work. He made film of it, he took photographs of it, the books were illustrated from it, and just before he died he passed all his research over to us so that we could amalgamate it and fit it with other concepts of therapy. There's one doctor which we have left out in your list, and he was very, very important, and that's Dr. Harold Saxon Burr. Without the concepts that he formulated, we shouldn't be in the position we are today. It's only thanks to these people who have laid the foundations on which we can construct this therapy that we owe so very much to.
Dr. Saxon Burr was associated with Yale University?
He was at Yale University,
and
yes.
His main work involved?
His main work was being able to discover that you can measure the frequencies of radiation outside of the body. When he first postulated this theory, I mean, it was mistrusted. I mean, at that day and time, I mean, very little was known about it, and no one quite went along with what he was saying. But fortunately, before he left this planet, he was able to come back to Yale University, and I think the expression is his picture was turned away from facing the wall, and there's now a picture on the wall again, because he was a very famous and a very talented man, and the work that he did was absolutely invaluable in the fields of research. And we find that now we're moving more and more into this field of research, that more and more of the technical truths which he wrote up and experimented with are of invaluable use to us.
What are your basic principles of using sound or cymatic therapy as a healing tool?
In the first and early days of this, we kept it locked into the use of muscular diseases, bone diseases, joint deformities, rheumatism, arthritis, fibrositis. Now, we kept it into these various diseases for several purposes. The main one was to accumulate as much information and knowledge and case histories as we possibly could to validate our concept and our theory. But also there was other things coming to the concept, and that was it was very easy to treat because you treated the surface of the body. But as it has gone along over the past 20 years, we have found now that we can treat all parts of the body, and including the internal organs. And year by year, we are having reports fed back to us from various doctors and clinics that are using the instrumentation that are feeding back new results, and new points are coming to light.
Perhaps you could enlighten us a bit more about how exactly you could use a sound or a tone to counteract a disease or something that is not balanced properly in the body.
Well, if every organ and every part of the human anatomy gives off a signal, providing all those signals are in line with the general harmonic of the whole body, then you are in good health. But if for any reason, irrespective of what it is, if for any reason any of those frequencies fall out of alignment, then you are diseased or out of harmony, disharmonic. Also, another thing which is very important is that this simplifies to a large extent the method of administering treatment or administering medicine. You see, a lot of these instruments are now being developed for third world countries. Now, we can't hope to train third world people directly into medicine over a short space of time. And if we don't do something quickly, I mean, many people are going to be in dire pain and straits of which no help is done, because, I mean, there are far too few medical practitioners to be able to deal with the amount of people that need help and treatment. Therefore, the effect of diagnosing a condition is not so vitally important. If you're dealing with it medically, a diagnosis is vitally important, because otherwise you would administer the wrong medication. But if you're dealing with some internal organ that is out of alignment and you're assessing it by its vibrational force field, then providing you can correct, or there's some method or some technique that can correct this vibrationary force field, irrespective of the condition which is causing it, you're on the right track. Mm-hmm. So therefore, many people can be helped merely by injecting the frequency back into the structure. And what also you've got to remember is that the frequency you're injecting is the natural frequency. You're working hand in hand with nature. You're not doing anything contrary to nature, because the adverse condition is contrary to nature. If you're putting in the corrected frequency and signal, the human structure is very keen to get back into alignment. This is one of the principal problems that have been in the organ transplant in surgery. It is the harmonic concept. Everything is taken into consideration when a transplant is done, whether it's by kidney transplant or heart transplant. Everything is taken into consideration. But up until a short while ago, we gave no consideration to the harmonic. And therefore, if the harmonic of that transplanted heart is not in line with the harmonics of the rest of that system, we use the term the body rejects the transplant. This is merely what it means. It rejects it because the harmonic evaluation of that heart will not fit in with the rest of the harmonics of the system in the body.
So in other words, in order to utilize a sound or a series of harmonics as a healing tool, what you would do is you would inject this into the body, and that which was diseased or vibrating out of harmony or ease with the rest of the body would somehow resonate back to its proper frequency.
Back to its proper frequency. But one thing we've got to be careful in this, you use the word inject. Now, if we use the word inject, a lot of people think we're going to stick a needle into them and inject something. We transmit it into the system. So the system is easy, there is no breaking of skin or surface, no needles are used. It is an application which is applied to the surface of the body. And if you apply sound in the audible range to the surface of the body, it will transmit itself right straight through the body and out the other side. Now, if there's nothing organically incorrect in the area through which that travels, it will travel straight through and be rejected on the far side. No harm will be done, no damage will be done. But if there's any abnormality in the frequency of the area that you're projecting the frequency field to, then it will rectify that as it passes through. And merely by simply placing the hand on the far side to which the applicator is applied, you can tell whether the condition is advanced, or whether it's very bad, or whether it's very slight. Because if the frequency signal travels through very quickly, there is very little wrong in that area. But if it takes some seconds or a minute before it travels through, then you know it's meeting obstacles on its passage through the structure.
What sort of cases have you worked with?
Well, we've dealt actually, over that period of time with many thousands of cases. The early work in the early days was muscular rheumatism, arthritis, fibrositis, and the point was to treat these people. Now, in advanced cases, we particularly chose advanced cases in some cases to see how long or how much improvement we could get, where medically speaking we said it was incurable and gone too far. In some of these cases, the patients had had rheumatic disorders or arthritic disorders for a period of 30 years. They were elderly people. In many of these cases, we were able to stabilize the condition and prevent further deterioration. But in lots of cases, we got improvement, and if we got cases early enough, then we got a cure. But since then, many cases have been dealt with which have no sort of relationship to the cases we started off with. I mean, we've treated heart conditions, lung conditions, bronchial conditions, intestinal troubles. Most of these conditions now can all be treated by this technique and this method.
You have some slides that you're going to show us which may tell us a little bit about the effects of sound on some of the inorganic matter.
Well, that is correct, because a lot of these slides were originally done by Dr. Jenin, showing the effect on substance and liquids and fluids of particular sound frequencies. Now, although they have no medical validity at this particular point in time, because we've moved on further to that, they are interesting in as much as you can see the effect. And I think it's always more convincing if you can see rather than just to hear what someone's talking about. So therefore, if you look at the film, the slides, if you look at these slides, you will see how the intricate patterns which we can formulate in substance can be changed merely by altering the frequency fields.
Well, let's take a look at some of these now.
We're going to show you now a few slides to give you some idea, because I think if you get a visual interpretation of what we have been discussing, you get a better impression of exactly what we're doing, where we can go, what we can create, and what we can form. It is scientifically correct to say that shape and form owe their shape and form solely to sound. And by these slides, we are able to show you how that shape and form can be held and repeated as many times as we wish, merely by the use of sound. Here we show one single drop of water placed on a plate to which the frequency field has been attached. By this means, we've been able to make it visual for you to see the geometric forms that can be formed when the cymatic frequency is filled into the structure. Here we have just one single drop of water vibrating at a low frequency. The low frequency gives the illusion that it is almost solid or semi-solid. It is not. It is just clear tap water and nothing more. Now, if we change that frequency, we can change the form and the shape. This is again the same drop of water as in the previous picture, but the frequency field has changed. We have changed it, and so long as that frequency exists, this shape and form will maintain its hold. It will act in this particular way every time this frequency is placed into the plate, which is the dark area around the outside. If we change the frequency back, we can reverse it back to the previous one. But each time we change, so the frequency modulates the single drop of water that's showing on the plate. Here again we have the same metal plate and the same drop of water. We haven't changed the water in any way, exactly the same water, but again we have changed the frequency field. Within this we are using single frequencies and not the multiple frequencies of the cymatic instrument. But as the frequency goes higher, you will notice that the design within it becomes a little more ethereal. In other words, we are seeing more spaces between. But even so, the spaces are still contained water. Again, same plate, same water. But again, the frequency has changed, and we're becoming a little more ethereal again. It's gradually tightening up onto these areas and sparsing out in these areas, making the design a little more ethereal, looking less solid, in other words. Now, if the frequency field was changed back, we could recreate any one of these back in line, or move them up in line. We can recreate this time and time again and make the same patterns over and over again. Now, here we have a complete change both of the material that we're using and also the frequency field that's being fed in. This was our first realization that we could, apart from making a flat diagrammatic form on the plate, we could evolve it into a three-dimensional figure or form. What we are feeding into here is 5 frequencies into the plate, which causes this malleable plastic to lift up, to formulate into this form and shape and fold itself into the center groove along the top. It's in constant movement, but keeping the constant form and shape. This was the first realization that the cymatic concept and the cymatic principle could formulate a design and a pattern which was in similarity aligned to the formation structures within the human body. Here we have a picture of cellular development, showing exactly how the cell structure forms and how this interrelating form folds into this center crevice. It is a moving mass the whole time, moving in constantly, enfolding within itself. Here we have something which is just plastic. It's pliable plastic, but we're feeding a field into it which will create the same movement and basically the same form of the structure as the natural one that preceded it. Here again we have another picture of a cell development dividing into the 4 concepts and the outer rim around the outside. Again, in a constant state of enfoldment, one side from the outer moving into the inner from all 4 sides in a constant state. If this was on a moving picture, it would look like a living amoeba pulsing and moving. We have another picture which is very similar in appearance to the last one that we showed you, but this one is again plastic, being formulated into this shape and form by a cymatic frequency. Except that here we have, if you notice, there are 5 areas within it instead of 4. But the same action is taking place, an enfolding movement from the outer rim to the inner points, from the outer rim to the inner points. In other words, like a living, evolving mass. But it owes its life wholly and solely to the vibration or the frequency field that's being fed into it and nothing else. Here we have a very highly magnified picture of the forefinger of a newborn child, showing the sort of cell development that is on the skin surface. This is lycopodium dust, vibrating at a similar frequency, formulating itself up into, again, these small center points, almost a replica of the cell formation of the child's fingers. Now, as you can see by the slides that you have seen, we can reproduce the most fantastic shapes and forms. We can almost duplicate parts of the human anatomy and structure merely by putting the correct frequency into place and utilizing it. These things can be reproduced as many times as we want. Again and again, we can reproduce them and watch them almost like living shapes, living forms, living amoeba. But they owe their life wholly and solely to sound, and perhaps we do too.
Well, that was very, very interesting, Peter. Some of those slides were quite astounding, especially the ones that we saw where the sound formation was almost exactly duplicate of the cellular formation. There's also a film that you have made with Dr. Hans Jenin on this material, is it not true?
That's correct. I think if you see the actual film on it, it gives you a better concept and a better idea of how these shapes and forms can move. In some parts of the film, it looks almost as if it's a living, moving amoeba that's existing there. But all of it owes its life wholly, solely, and simply to sound. You stop the sound and everything stops. You turn on the sound and everything becomes alive. It looks like living shape and form.
Wasn't there something in the Bible? In the beginning was the Word. I'm talking about the word maybe meaning sound or something like that?
Oh, yes, we love to use that one. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Well, I read this many times as a child and it didn't make much sense to me. I quite admit it was interesting, but it didn't have much sense. But what we didn't realize, and we didn't realize until comparatively recently, is that within this we have a scientific formula. So if we turn it into the modern idiom, into the great voids of space, sound causes matter to take shape, because it's basically what it does. You can take any matter, what you like, whether it's a liquid, whether it's oil, whether it's dust, whether it's sand, whatever it is, and you can form it into the most intricate and fascinating designs and patterns and shapes and forms. But you see, most of this work, the basic work, we have followed it up, it's true, was done by Dr. Hans Jenin. But this, medically speaking, was not what we wanted. What we needed was a harmonic that would form not into a flat shape. You see, most of these are flat shapes on the plate. We wanted something that would form into a three-dimensional form and shape, something that would defy gravity, if you like, in which we had injected levitation. Well, when I first went into the laboratory and asked my technician if he could formulate some way in which we could create levitation, he thought I'd go and start raving mad and said, well, that's impossible. But anyhow, from single frequencies, we tried 2 frequencies, 3 frequencies, 4 frequencies, and the patterns become more intriguing, they became different, they become, if I may dare use this word, they become almost ethereal because they become very fine and delicate, but it still wasn't what we were after. And we were almost at the point of giving up And we said, well, we'll try one more, we'll try 5. And when we tried 5 frequencies, we nearly jumped up in the air because it actually happened. The stuff that we had on the plate literally blew off the plate. So what we did then was to put a plastic, which we thought we could bind and hold together, and we put this plastic on the plate, and sure enough it formed itself up into a form defying the pull of gravity and started to form up into a holistic form and shape, 3-dimensional. This is what we needed, this is what we wanted, because this is the basic sort of formulative structure of shape and form in the human body. So we were really onto something there.
So in a way, then the sound creates the form.
The sound will create the form and will hold it for just as long as you want it to hold. But if you change that frequency, then it will, if you want to use a word, you will have mutation. You will change the shape. So therefore it is again correct to say, scientific fact, that as the sound, so the shape and the form. So there basically we conclude from that the human body in the form in which we see it is held in that formulative pattern and structure wholly and solely by the sound it contains and makes.
Peter, could you tell us a little bit about the use of cymatic therapy in hospitals and other clinical settings? Is it being used in hospitals today?
Oh yes, most certainly. Mostly into the smaller consulting rooms. It seems to be more an individual thing rather than a collective thing in some of the large hospitals. But in the smaller establishments, in consulting rooms and clinics, it's proved absolutely invaluable. So many of the conditions, especially simple things like, what should I say, simple to the practitioner but difficult to the person who's receiving it, and that is slip disc, which can be horribly painful, can keep people away from their work or their offices or their employment for sometimes weeks on end. There's very little that can be done about it except tell them to rest, and that's about it, and give them a painkiller. Well, now with the aid of cymatics, all this can change. We can alter all this. With the application of cymatic therapy for approximately 10 to 15 minutes, the pain will ease down considerably. And invariably, when the tension is moved out of the surrounding area and tissue, very often, without manipulation, it will slip back in place. But even if a manipulation has to take place, it can be done easily and simply. Therefore, the older technique of osteopathic manipulation, which has been the, shall I say, the arguing point between the medical profession and the osteopaths, especially in the UK for so long, is now overcome. No longer do we have to, what we term a cold manipulation, in other words, force it back into position, because once you've used cymatic on, the whole area relaxes, eases, and it will be comfortably back in position. Now, there are many other things that we can ease and relieve pain without the administering of drugs and painkillers. It has been found and checked by specialists in London who are using this instrument that the endophorins, which are the secretion from the brain, which ease off pain, it's like nature's painkiller, is activated by the transmission of frequencies into the structure. We have used this in hospitals where patients have been injured in mining disasters where the roof has crashed in. Now, we all know medically there's very little we can do from this, or except to clean it up, make them comfortable, and give them a painkiller if necessary, and just hope that time will heal it. Well, now we can do much more than that, because for applying this frequency above the damaged area, we can deaden down to a large extent the pain, and there is no side effects as if we have given drugs to administer it.
Have you tried this in the situations of cancer, for instance?
Well, now, cancer is something which unless you are an MD, you are not allowed to treat. We've got to remember that these instruments are in the hands of osteopaths, chiropractors, nurses, nurse consultants, all these kind of people who are efficient practitioners within their own rights. and they are using these instruments. Now, with this instrument, they are not breaking the law in any way, shape, or form, because we do not deal with cancer to obliterate it. We do not attempt to disintegrate the cancer. We treat the organ to which it is being troublesome. In other words, if it's a lung cancer, we treat the lung. We strengthen and fortify the lung and let the cancer take care of itself, and invariably this does happen.
Dr. Manners, I know you brought your cymatic instrument here from England. Do you think you can show us how it works?
Yes, we can do that. That presents no problem now. In its early stages, of course, it was a vast instrument which was very clumsy, very difficult, and couldn't be moved. Now it is transportable, it's no larger than a large attache case, and we can utilize it in homes, or hospitals, clinics, nursing homes, consulting rooms. It can be carried by the practitioner or the doctor wherever you would like to use it.
Ah, splendid, splendid. We have Priscilla King, a nurse consultant here who has volunteered to act as a patient in this situation. I guess she'll take a little time off from her nursing patients to help and act as a patient. So why don't we bring Priscilla up here, and she will be happy to let you work on her with your cymatic instrument.
Yes, we'd be most happy to do this, but at this point we must add that we shall only be able to use the applicator unit for this form of treatment. There is another form of treatment which is applied from the same instrument, which has become known as biocymatics. Now, biocymatics is using silent sound. There is no sound whatsoever. You are using the basic energy out of the sound, but in order to use this, you need the patient definitely in the clinic, because saline solution and pads have to be used for its application. If I might explain how this functions, if a patient has, what should I say, normal mobility in arms and legs, very often if they hear music or a beat in music, they will beat in time with it, either with a hand or with a foot. It's a very common occurrence. It's a very complicated thing if you run through all the procedures of it, but it's quite easy to do. But if there is paralysis or anything of that type within either the arm or the leg, the limb will not do it. Now, it won't do it because the left hemisphere of the brain is closed down on the synapse and it can't actually function it. But all the muscles may be correct, the nerves may be all right, joints, bones, everything is in order, but the synapse of the brain doesn't function the limb. Now, if we reverse the process of the cymatic input and put the input in through the hand and the arm, we can then re-establish a movement in that arm. And we can get the arm to beat in a normal, natural way. But that's not the end of the story. We can do that, and we've been able to do this for quite a number of years. Oh, it exercises the muscles, and it's very good, and it's quite interesting to the patient to be able to see a paralyzed arm moving and beating time. But that is not basically what we want. What we want is the synapse within the brain to start to activate this movement. Now, previously, it was extremely difficult to, shall we say, go into another dimension of healing with the ordinary medical profession. But of course, we're in more enlightened times now, and we can do this. So what we tell the patient is to close their eyes, to visualize on the paralyzed limb, see it in their mind or their mind's eye, and then as the impulse travels into the limb, to mentally lift at the same time. If they do this, then the synapse will start to function and we can get movement back into the tissue and the structure again.
Sorry we won't be able to see that aspect of the instrument being utilized, but I'm sure we will have an extraordinary experience watching this.
The instrument is so designed to make it as simple for operation as we possibly can. On this side of the instrument is a sonic computer which will formulate the basic frequencies that you require for treatment. This can be then locked into the mind of it, transferred and recorded to a magnetic tape, and it is then ready when you plug in your applicator on this side to apply to the patient. And the way we apply it to the patient is merely to switch it on and turn up the amount of output on the applicator. The applicator is then applied to the patient, but before it is applied to the patient, it's always advisable, remember we're interested in holistic medicine, and the patient is an individual, not a case. The patient is very often apprehensive, tense, perhaps tired and in pain. And we firmly believe that an application of your hand over the area first, before any treatment is given, has a soothing effect, beneficial effect, and the patient feels more confident. Then apply the frequency field. Now, the frequency field that you're applying, immediately it is applied, the patient will relax automatically. As you're coming to the patient, they're a little apprehensive. Once it is applied, they're perfectly content, easy, and relaxed, because the frequency you're filling in is entirely in relation to the natural frequency there. You are using a natural frequency. There is nothing injurious, nothing harmful, nothing that will do any harm at all. In this particular case, our nurse here hasn't any serious problems, but had she had serious problems and this joint was unmovable, a small application around the joint structure would ease down the tension, and after a few manipulations by the applicator, you would be able to gently move the joint without pain or discomfort. Up in the area here, which is always an area of congestion, pain, and discomfort, remember this is a very important area of the body because your eyes are controlled from here, the organ of balance is controlled from here, the facial muscles are controlled from here, and also the nerve going down the arm is all controlled from this area. It's a place where tension builds considerably. So therefore, by applying this over the area, you get a relaxed and comfortable feeling. Once the applicator is in contact with the patient, you have no further need to comfort or to reassure them. And it matters little whether it is a young baby, a small child, or whether it's an elderly patient. All of them relax, it's easy, pleasant, and comfortable. The frequency field that you are actually hearing is the sound which exists within muscle structure. That sound that you can hear is the actual sound that is contained within the muscle structure, amplified many, many thousands of times. And therefore, all that is necessary is to apply it over the area for ease, comfort, and relaxation. If they have come in and complained to you that there is pain in that shoulder and it's possibly rheumatism, they've not told you anything else perhaps, and you are treating this, they will very often say, "Doctor, I can feel something happening down in my knee." Now the reason for this being that there's possibly a slight rheumatic condition in the knee joint which they haven't necessarily told you about, but because the frequency field is traveling into the system, the whole system is consumed with it all the way around, and it will find any weakness anywhere in the body and deal with it as you're dealing with this area here. After you've done that for a little, if you are an osteopath or an orthopedic surgeon, then you can start to move. The area will move easily, it will relax. If you're going to move the arm joint, you'll find that you'll be able to move it easily and simply, and you will find the muscles will relax. How does that feel?
Very good. As you put that on me, I felt my whole body start to relax.
You can feel it across all around the body.
Yes.
That's right, yes, because it's transmitting into the whole of the structure of the body, you see.
Now that you have got the somatic instrument pretty well developed, you've had it for a number of years now and have been using it successfully, what are you doing now in terms of new frontiers of using sound?
Oh, quite a lot, a considerable amount. The instrument itself is fully developed. It's scientifically acceptable. It's medically approved. And we now have these instruments literally all over the world in use, particularly in the third world countries where we're able to train people efficiently and quickly to use the instrument. But our research field at the present moment is stepping now into light therapy, which is becoming known as chromatology. It was always previously thought that the effect of colored lights, as they termed it, was a kind of gimmick, in which you sat under a pretty light and it was very comfortable and it was very nice and very warm and very relaxing. Well, I'm afraid all that is now completely changed. We do know that light penetration can penetrate through the pores of the skin, it can affect the bloodstream, it can affect internal organs, it can do a considerable amount. We advocated many years ago that babies born with the bilirubin, which is yellow jaundice, should be treated, instead of blood transfusions and drugs, should be treated under blue radiation. This was very suspect for a long, long time, until one doctor in the United States tried it, used it, found it successful, and now this technique of treating bilirubin is used all over the world now.
So you're working with color, what else?
We're working with color, but we're also working with the action of the brain. We find that if we use these frequency fields, we can affect the left and right hemisphere of the brain, and we feel that very often a condition which causes paralysis or a problem in the human anatomy and structure has its seat in the left side of the brain. If we could only stimulate the right to sort of assist, take over, or form a bridge between the two, we could overcome a lot of problems. Well, now with the advent of sound in a new dimension, we're able to do just this. And our research now is into using headphones which feed different frequencies into the structure in the system, also applied at the same time as light radiations and cymatic frequencies. We're able to activate all the cell tissues and nerve ganglia within the body, and we're getting very, very good results. And it won't be long before we'll be able to discuss this and explain these details to you.
Wonderful. I look forward to hearing about those at a further date. If people are interested in trying to find out more about cymatic therapy, Peter, how do they reach you?
If they write to us, Dr. Manners, the Brett Forton, B-R-E-T-F-O-R-T-O-N, Brett Forton Hall, H-A-L-L, Clinic, Brett Forton, Vale of Evesham, E-V-E-S-H-A-M, Vale of Evesham, Worcestershire, England. We will attempt to answer every letter, if I possibly can, personally.
And this is also how they would get a cymatic instrument or information on the cymatic instrument, of course.
We also train students at our clinic so that we can qualify them in the use of cymatic therapy.
And in the United States, those of you who would like to contact me regarding various uses of sound and music for well-being, SHA, the Sound Healers Association, may be reached by writing Post Office Box 2240, Boulder, Colorado, 80306. We continue to work with Dr. Manners, and we are very, very grateful for having had him here tonight. We hope that the information which we've disseminated has been of use. We thank you, Dr. Manners, so very, very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. I've thoroughly enjoyed being here.
It's a pleasure here, too. Thank you.
What we see here is the effect of vibration on a specific substance, lycopodium powder, or spores of the club moss. We have strewn it uniformly on a diaphragm of stretched paper with a diameter of about 30 centimeters, which we now excite by vibration. This causes the powder to clump. We can see many small clumps, many small globular piles, and the more intense the vibration, the more piles there are. If the note is louder, that is to say, if the amplitude is increased, these masses of powder move to the center and make a kind of dust cloud there. An ever wider area of powder is affected, and more of these globules are formed. They are not at rest, but in a state of continuous motion. We can see a large circular shape forming in the middle and continuously moving. Sometimes it is whipped up into a cloud, as it is now, and sometimes it reverts to the solid dust particle form. These changes are caused by the differences in the intensity of the tone, that is, by the different amplitudes. In this experiment, the frequency, that is to say, the number of vibrations per second, is the same. And now we see the circular form and everything in a definite pattern of movement. Now we shall take a closer look at these movements. Here is one of these forms. We can see how the material rises up in the middle and is transported to the periphery. This pile of dust, this heap of particles, is in a process of convection. The material travels inwards from the edge along the bottom of the pile, rises up in the middle, and is then carried back to the periphery. Even if the intensity of the vibration changes, there is still a whole system of radial circulation. At certain frequencies, or with certain tones, an extraordinarily interesting phenomenon is seen. Watch. We see two regularly and continuously rotating areas at either end of a diameter, going round and round like weathercocks. This is the expression of a rotating wave motion. We can see they are rotating in an anti-clockwise direction. We now switch to a different frequency and produce the same phenomenon, but this time in a clockwise direction, because the frequency is different. If we go back to the previous frequency, we have the same phenomenon again in an anti-clockwise direction. Notice that this rotary movement does not affect the circulation or convection in the least. Now we can excite the same material with different tones all the way through the frequency band and watch what happens. Here we have lycopodium powder at a relatively soft-sounding tone, and we see that the pattern figures most prominently. we have motion too, and circulation, but above all, it is the structural pattern that strikes the eye. And all the shapes lying about here, looking like monkey nuts, have these patterns of structure. Again and again, there are convection cells, circulatory systems, forming there, making structural patterns in the lycopodium. Now, by changing the amplitude, that is, changing the volume of the tone, we can bring about a very interesting phenomenon. The tone is the same, but we introduce a burst, an amplitude burst, and every time we do so, it integrates the whole situation. These dynamic events now lead to a phenomenon of exceptional interest. You must realize that the same diaphragm and the same powder are used, but that the tones are different. Here we have a flow pattern. This means that where we had a structural pattern before, we now have a violent dynamic one. A current is formed and the powder rushes along in the flow path, leaving the black patches of the diaphragm completely free of powder. Everything is driven into the flow path by the vibration. We add more and more material, but the result is not confusion or chaos. Instead, everything falls into place in the strict flow pattern. A point to notice about all these phenomena is that they can be reproduced at any time, that the factors and conditions of the experiment are known with accuracy. We go on throwing in powder, and every time this attractive and clearly defined flow pattern keeps on emerging from the vibrational field. It is a circulatory system without walls. The walls are, so to speak, the area of vibration. The area of vibration provides the constraint which gives shape to the circulatory flow. Different flow patterns are formed at different frequencies. This is a kind of double current. but at other frequencies we have, as it were, a four-part or quadrantal pattern. Here we have a formation with 4 fields. Here again we throw in powder, and once more it is embodied in the exact quadrantal flow pattern created by the vibration. This is a particularly interesting phenomenon because it reveals not only the structuralizing effect of vibration, but also its dynamic and kinetic effect. Here we have a cloud of lycopodium powder created by vibration, and in it we can see extraordinary life and movement. We have eddy formations and sometimes even regular pairs of vortices. Then we have turbulences or unstable wave formations. And the interesting thing is that during all this welter of movement, we have a structuralizing element on the diaphragm. At the very same time, there is this zebra pattern on the diaphragm. Its one pole is structure, and its other pole dynamics. Even if we intensify the vibrations and make a very thick cloud, this pattern still takes shape on the diaphragm. As we slowly reduce the tone, which is a decrescendo to the ear, the pattern created comes into view. In the vibrational fields of this lycopodium and of other materials, we saw time and again that in certain places the material is thrown up, then all is quiet, then it is thrown up once more, then all is quiet again. We saw that it kept to certain places, that it did not splash about just anyhow, but that everything took place in particular spots. In this shot we can see how there is one place on the diaphragm in the middle of our picture where the material keeps on being thrown up. And observation has shown that what we have here is an interference phenomenon. The action of the waves is cumulative, their effects are summated at these spots, causing the mass to be ejected. Then quiet returns. Then there is another summation. These events are reminiscent of processes in solar physics in which a tendency to repetitive eruptions, solar eruptions, has been observed. This repetitive tendency is particularly prominent in the chromosphere. Here, interferences are at work. Here we can watch what these hemispheres are doing. There are many different things to see. Structure, for instance, which we have observed before, and which appears on these circular forms as patches. Convection, which we have also observed before, can be seen here too. But what is particularly interesting about these hemispheres is the curious way they move. They creep round. They do not disintegrate. They do not break up or crumble. And as they creep round, they take everything with them. When movement takes place in one direction, what happens is that all the material slips and glides along together. These small circular forms move like amoebae, but only like amoebae. They are not living systems. They move like amoebae, or, to borrow a term from biology, they move correlatively. These are movements of correlation. That is to say, the movement always takes place as a whole. Also, we see how these small formations unite, combine, and separate. In this way, we realize there is always a whole. We always have something entire and complete before us. This is a particularly interesting phenomenon. We are able to discover it by using crystal oscillators. There are rotary processes, circular movements, which proceed with absolute regularity. Centrifugal force is not a factor here. The whole pattern is elicited by continuous parallel waves. Here we can see the currents running in contrary directions and creating a rotary effect or revolution. Here there is something very interesting to watch. Once again we have interference. That is to say, there are two tones. One moment the waves summate, then they cancel each other out. They summate again, and every time they summate, we have dynamics. And when they cancel each other out, we have rest and structural pattern. We see structure alternating continually with dynamics. Structure and dynamics. What we see then is not caused by switching the vibration on and off, but is itself a vibrational phenomenon. Structures appear, clouds are formed, there is movement and change, forms emerge, all as the result of interference. Whole squads of forms appear, unite again, separate again, but always there is wholeness. It is as if these vibrational fields were providing models for a holistic theory. Here again we have continuous waves. These are very large diaphragms, rubber diaphragms, more than a square meter in size. Whole squads stream along in one direction, others in another direction. Structural patterns appear, structural patterns unite. We are looking into a whole landscape of lycopodium created by vibration. Once again, we have material rotating under the influence of continuous waves. And we can see how, in certain places, there is an inward flowing current, and in other places, there is also an inward flowing current from the other direction. So we have, as it were, rivers of material flowing in from diametrically opposite directions, and they are then revealed in these regions of rotation. The points of inflow are diametrically opposed in these rotating areas. Here we can see very clearly how the material flows in at bottom left and top right at diametrically opposite points, and in this way is incorporated into the rotary process. Here again there are currents, parallel continuous waves moving in opposite directions, which carry powder along with them. This last experiment is really extraordinarily interesting. We are looking into a funnel. We apply vibration, and the material is brought out of the bottom of the funnel. It is transported upwards against the force of gravity. But it is not simply thrown out. It moves round the periphery of the diaphragm, round its circumference, and then goes down into the funnel again. If we intensify the tone, then the upward march of the material is preponderant. If we make the tone soft, the material slides down again because the static friction on the undersurface of the diaphragm is reduced. The adhesion is reduced, and consequently the powder slides down again when the vibration is less intense. Sometimes then we have a process in which the material moves out, and sometimes a process in which it slips back. When it slips back, it covers the whole cone. When it slips out, it climbs up the wall of the cone. So, on the one hand, we have an anti-gravitation effect, and, on the other, a sliding effect resulting from reduced adhesion. When the vibration is of a particular character, we have a process in which the material is transported out and, at the same time, slips back, so that there is a convection current on a grand scale. This is a detail from part of the edge. It is a complex phenomenon, but all in all, its organization is unitary. Anti-gravitation, a downward slide due to reduced adhesion, and convection of the whole mass of powder. Here we see a heated and therefore liquid blob of kaolin excited by vibration. In this experiment we can follow how the phase of the material changes as it cools. First of all, we have wave fields. We can watch the liquid substance rippling. Gradually it cools, and the liquid phase changes to the plastic, and from the plastic phase it proceeds to the solid phase, and we can therefore speak of solidification under the influence of vibration. Here, the plastic state has been reached. There are no longer waves, but a clumped mass which is rotating and circulating in itself. The substance gets harder and harder and more solid until, when it has cooled, the kaolin is completely rigid. All these forms, all these structures which we see here, have been created purely and simply because the substance has solidified under the influence of vibration. We see branched and ramifying patterns. These are not crystallized forms, but sculptural shapes resulting from vibration. We can call them dendritic structures, finally passing over into filigree. What is involved then is a change of phase under the influence of vibration, solidification, that is, as an effect of vibration.
What the hell goes on? Some jerk shaving. Hey, cut off that lawnmower.
Relax, Junior. I got a date with the Queen of Sheba. She's allergic to beards.
Are you silly? Take it easy, I'll fix it.
Frequency modulation, or FM, is a big step forward in radio. When you tune in, you hear what the studio mic hears. There's no static, no heterodyne squeals. The guy with the electric razor can use it all he wants. A GI can dial his girl's number, All these things in the same area, but they won't bother reception. Well, you've seen what FM means to ordinary everyday reception. But what's its military value? Just this. Until the Army turned to FM for some of its installations, radio interference was a communication headache. Sets out on the battlefield picked up static. Static that hashed up the incoming signal. Tank cracks created static that made reception damn near impossible. Then there are teletypes, battery chargers, armored cars, tanks. The material of modern war, as well as such natural phenomena as storms, created enormous amounts of electrical interference. Frequency modulation licks this problem, and that's why we want you to know something about it. Now, the best way we can explain FM is to compare it with AM, meaning, of course, amplitude modulation. The kind that's never been able to comb static out of its hair. Now, this oscillator generates a radio wave we call the carrier. It's then fed into the amplifier where it's strengthened. But it's unmodulated, unchanging. It carries no message, or as we say, no intelligence. It's something like the steady, monotonous note of a trumpet. In order to carry a message, the wave must have the intelligence impressed on it. Now, in AM, it's done like this. The intelligence goes into the mic as sound. The mic changes the sound into electrical energy that varies at an audio rate according to the sound. The electrical energy is fed into the modulator, where it's amplified. From here, it goes into the amplifier, where the fluctuations in electrical energy are impressed on the carrier, or radio wave, generated by the oscillator. Now, what's that mean? Well, just this. The carrier is modulated. It has its amplitude or strength changed by the fluctuating electrical energy from the modulator. Then the wave that comes from the amplifier looks like this. In this way, the carrier has its amplitude changed by the intelligence. The wave that's transmitted is an AM wave. The varying strength or amplitude of the wave carries the intelligence in AM radio. These waves are radiated by the antenna. Now, what happens in an AM receiver? First, let's take the AM wave as it approaches the antenna of our receiver. The AM receiver picks up the waves. First, it amplifies them, this way. Then it feeds them to the demodulator. The demodulator changes the RF amplitude variations back into audio frequency energy. This audio energy is built up or amplified by audio frequency stages. Then it is finally fed into a speaker, which turns it back into sound. That's how amplitude modulation works. Of course, we've gone over parts of it pretty sketchily because we're taking for granted you're fairly well grounded in AM radio by now. All's fine in AM. Everything works perfectly when operating conditions are ideal. But suppose there's electrical interference of some sort. For instance, here's our transmitter and here's our receiver. Electrical impulses of all sorts produce amplitude variations in a radio wave, much the same as the audio signal in the AM transmitter over there to the left. Lightning, for instance, hitchhikes onto the transmitted wave, messing it all up, confusing the intelligence whenever it strikes. Notice how fuzzy the RF wave between the sets becomes at these times. The AM receiver can't separate the amplitude variations that carry intelligence from those that carry just noise. Noise, that's the problem. Now, what are we going to do about it? Well, we know that a radio wave has both frequency and amplitude. So far, the intelligence, represented by this audio wave, has been transmitted by holding the frequency of the carrier constant and varying its amplitude, its strength, this way. But as we've seen earlier, lightning and other electrical disturbances also vary the amplitude and upset or interfere with the original intelligence. But engineers have discovered that lightning and other electrical disturbances have a negligible effect on the frequency of a radio wave. And so they started reasoning. Why not hold the amplitude constant and vary the frequency or wavelength and make it carry the message? Where AM carries its intelligence by increasing and decreasing the strength of its carrier, this new type would do the same job by varying or modulating the frequency of its carrier. Any static that jumps onto the wave affects only the amplitude, not the frequency. The intelligence, therefore, is not affected. FM radio is based on this idea. The changing frequencies carry the message as clear as a bell. There are several types of FM transmitters used by the Army. To get a good, clear picture of frequency modulation and its general characteristics, we'd better consider a simple set first. Just as in AM, the carrier wave is produced, or generated, if you like, by an oscillator. In FM, this carrier wave is called the rest, or resting frequency, when it's unmodulated. That is, when there's no sound being produced. The frequency depends on the values of the coil and capacitor in the tank circuit. Change the value of either the coil or the capacitor, and the frequency changes. Now, if there were any way for the audio signal to change the coil or capacitor values, the result would be an FM wave at the output. You can accomplish this by placing a capacitor microphone in parallel with the capacitor in the tank circuit. This way. Capacitor microphones contain two plates, one of which vibrates when struck by sound waves. Of course, this rhythm is greatly slowed down. In reality, it would be anything from 16 to perhaps 16,000 vibrations per second. When the space in here between the plates varies, due to the vibration, the capacity of the mic will also vary at the same rate. Now take this in, because it's the way the transmitter operates. The capacity of the mic affects the capacitance in the tank circuit. The capacitance of the tank circuit affects the frequency of the oscillator. The frequency of the oscillator determines the frequency of the RF wave. The RF wave is therefore frequency modulated in accordance with the vibrations of the mic plate. In other words, the frequency now varies at an audio rate when sound hits the mic. When there isn't any sound, the diaphragm of the capacitor mic keeps straight and motionless. The oscillator produces its original or resting frequency. When the first vibration of a sound wave hits the mic, it pushes the diaphragm plate closer to the stationary plate. That action increases the capacitance of the mic. This increased capacitance decreases the frequency of the oscillator. The closer the plates in the mic, the less the frequency and the farther apart the waves. When the diaphragm moves away from the stationary plate, the oscillation increases and the waves squeeze closer together. Two complete cycles cause the FM waves to squeeze, stretch, squeeze, stretch. The higher the note or sound, the higher its frequency. Now, what effect does that have on the FM wave? Just this. Now, take a look at this diagram. This center line, with the figure 40 megacycles written below it, represents the rest frequency of our oscillator. Now, keep that in mind. Rest frequency, represented by this line, is 40 megacycles. That is, without being modulated, it oscillates the rate of 40 million cycles per second. Now, what will cause it to vary from rest frequency? Any sound impressed on the capacitor microphone, of course. For example, let's say we modulate the carrier with a 500 cycle note. we get a frequency that swings back and forth above and below the rest frequency 500 times per second. Suppose we increase the frequency of the note to 1,000 cycles per second. See the difference? This 1,000-cycle note causes the FM wave to swing back and forth twice as fast as did the 500-cycle note. I know. You're wondering why these two notes of different pitch swing back and forth the same amount across the rest frequency. Well, that brings us to a very important point, or rather 2 points: rate of change and amount of change. You know now that frequency affects rate of change. Let's see what affects amount of change. Take the 500-cycle note again, but make it louder. Then this happens. See it? We've got the same rate of change across rest frequency, but the distance of the swing to either side of the rest frequency becomes greater. The distance is called deviation. So the frequency of a note or sound determines how many times the swing takes place, and the loudness determines the amount of swing, or deviation. Now you can see that a great amount of deviation might cause a little trouble. That is, the deviation would go too far and interfere with another FM transmitter. So the Army sets the maximum deviation for any channel at 40 kilocycles on either side of this rest frequency. In other words, the strongest audio signal that can be used for modulating a transmitter is one that allows only a deviation of 40 kilocycles on either side of the rest frequency. This whole thing, 40 kilocycles on one side and the same on the other, is the carrier swing. Thus, here we have a carrier swing of 80 kilocycles altogether. One more thing, there has to be a separation between channels. That is, we've got to have some method of protecting one channel from possible slop-over from another. So, here's what we do. We provide guard bands on each side of the maximum deviation. Each band is 10 kilocycles wide, making a total of 20 kilocycles. The channel allotted to each station consists of 2 deviation ranges of 40 kilocycles each, plus a 10 kilocycle guard band on each side. That's a total of 100 kilocycles. Remember, what we've seen so far is how we get the FM signal. We showed you an FM transmitter being modulated by a capacitor-type microphone because that was the easiest way of getting the point across. However, the Army uses 2 other systems of getting FM. They're called reactance tube and phase modulation. There's one big difference between the two. Reactance tube modulates in the oscillator stage, while phase does it in some succeeding stage. But no matter what method we use, an FM receiver will pick up the signal, and that gets us to the FM receiver. Naturally, because we're dealing with FM waves, we can't use the ordinary AM receiver. But the two are fairly similar. As a matter of fact, there are only 3 main differences. Number 1 is bandpass. All bandpass means is we've got to have a receiver that will pass the wide band or range of frequencies we're bound to get with FM. Taking care of that is pretty easy because it's just a matter of circuit design. Now here's a difference we can't brush off as easily as we did the bandpass problem. A frequency modulation receiver has to have some means of cutting or clipping off amplitude variations which, in FM, carry noise, not intelligence. So we get rid of them. How we do it, we'll see in a minute. And here's the third difference. The FM receiver has to be able to change the frequency variations back into audio amplitude variations. Now, let's see what a block diagram of an AM superhet receiver looks like. To change the AM receiver to an FM receiver, we have to make changes in the set. First, in the circuit to take care of bandpass. Now the amplitude limiting part. In place of this IF amplifier, we put a device called a limiter. This takes care of clipping off the amplitude variations that could hash up reception. All right, the limiter takes care of this. Now, something to take care of our third condition. In place of the demodulator in the AM receiver, we put a device called a discriminator. So, now we've satisfied all three conditions. The bandpass by means of circuit design, the amplitude limiting by means of the limiter, and the translation of frequency variations back into audio amplitude variations by the discriminator. Now we have an FM receiver. But there's a little more to it than just saying we put this here and that there. We want to understand what happens. All right? Here's a simplified diagram of a limiter. It consists of a tuned grid circuit, a resistor, a tuned plate circuit, and bypass capacitors. Also, this sharp cutoff tube. It operates at zero initial grid bias and low plate voltage. Let's see what the action of this limiter circuit is. Here is our FM wave as it leaves the transmitter. It's free of any amplitude variations. But as you saw before, the best laid plans of men and radio go astray, and our wave doesn't stay nice and clean. Amplitude variations creep in, caused by electrical disturbances. So, the wave looks like this when it reaches the antenna of our receiver. The frequency hasn't changed, but there are amplitude variations on the positive portion of the wave and variations on the negative portion. Now, let's take this wave through the limiter. The incoming wave induces a voltage in the first tuned circuit. As you see here, the grid of the tube is connected directly to the tuned circuit. Now, with no initial bias, it stands to reason that any positive amplitude swing on the signal will make the grid positive. Therefore, since the grid is positive, it attracts electrons from the cathode of the tube. The electrons move along as a grid current. The more positive the amplitude variations of the wave, the more positive the grid will become, and the greater the grid current flow. But the grid current flow through this resistor produces a voltage drop which tends to buck the positive signal. Now you can see what's going to happen. As the positive amplitude of the wave increases, more and more electrons are attracted to the grid. More and more current flows through the grid circuit. This increased current flowing through the grid resistor develops an increasing negative voltage that acts against the incoming positive signal. The voltage drop across the resistor finally becomes so great that it prevents any further increase in positive amplitude of the signal from getting to the grid. Only a certain amount gets through. And what happens to the wave? Just this. The amplitude variations on the positive side of the wave are clipped, and with them go the noises they carry. But we've still got these to worry about. The negative amplitude variations. The clipping of the negative amplitude swings is simpler than clipping the positive. You've just seen that a positive swing in signal amplitude turns the grid positive. So we'll naturally get a negative grid when the swing of amplitude is negative. And the more that swing, the more negative the grid will become. And what effect does that have? Say the negative amplitude swing is just beginning. As soon as it begins, the grid becomes negative. That means that the grid will repel electrons that try to hop over from the cathode of the tube. Just a small negative charge in the grid means that not all the electrons from the cathode will be repelled. Some will flow through and get to the plate, thus causing a plate current to flow. But as the negative amplitude swing of the signal becomes larger, the grid becomes more negative. It repels more and more electrons that try to get over from the cathode. Now remember, I said we used a sharp cutoff tube in the limiter. The tube is biased very quickly beyond cutoff. Therefore, it will quickly reach the point where its grid becomes so negative that it will repel any electrons emitted by the cathode. We get this effect on the incoming signal. Here's the incoming signal, just the negative amplitude swing of it. As it becomes more and more negative, the action we just went over on the grid takes place. Suddenly, because of the sharp cutoff point of the tube, plate current ceases to flow. And any further negative amplitude variations won't get by. The negative portion of the wave now looks like this. Of course, the negative amplitude swings back up. This means that the grid will become less negative until it reaches a point where the electrons can once more flow through to the plate. Plate current flows again. Now, combine the positive swing clipping action with the negative, and we get this. Here is our FM signal coming in with all its amplitude variations. It gets to the limiter. The two clipping actions we saw take place. First, the positive. The swing goes up and up until it's stopped, clipped off. Eventually, it starts down again toward the negative swing. It reaches the start of the negative swing and causes the grid to become negative. When the cutoff point of the tube is reached, the negative swing is clipped. The result of these clipping actions is this kind of a wave. Now we have what we went after, a wave with constant amplitude, with all amplitude variations clipped off. The intelligence is still with us, carried in the frequency variations. But we still have a little trouble to get rid of. Notice that the tops and bottoms are squared off. That will mean distortion of the signal. The tuned plate circuit takes care of that. It's able to smooth off any irregularities or sharp corners of a wave by what is called flywheel effect. So the wave that leaves the limiter will look like this. And that's it. Now the wave is ready for the discriminator, the device that interprets these frequency variations as audio voltage variations. Now here's a simplified diagram of a discriminator. It consists of a tuned circuit, a diode detector tube, and a load resistor with a bypass capacitor across it. Now, as you know, a tuned circuit can pass a maximum voltage at its resonant frequency. That is, when the frequency of the incoming wave is the same as the resonant frequency of the circuit. Now let's see the response curve of the tuned circuit. We'll say its resonant frequency is here. Now, here's a line that represents voltage, varying amounts of it. Any one point along this line represents the amount of voltage at that particular spot. Let this line represent rest frequency. the discriminator is purposely tuned off resonance with the incoming frequency. All right, as long as an unmodulated carrier is coming in, say at this frequency, it means that the output at the discriminator is a steady DC voltage. But now, watch what happens as the frequency of an FM wave, with its rest frequency here, gets closer to the resonant frequency of the discriminator. Now don't forget, here's the resonant frequency of the discriminator, and here's the voltage at the rest frequency of our FM wave. Now, when the frequency of the incoming wave is changed so that it moves closer to the resonant frequency of the discriminator, more voltage is passed by the discriminator. This means that the voltage output of the discriminator will rise in step. When the frequency of the incoming FM wave reaches its peak, the voltage reaches its peak. Now, as the frequency of the wave gets farther away from the resonant frequency of the discriminator, less voltage is passed. Here's the entire action. Watch it. So you can see that the voltage output of the discriminator is an audio frequency voltage, which is exactly in step with the frequency variations. This wave is then fed to the AF amplifiers and onto the speaker exactly as in the AM receiver. FM is the answer to the static problem, static that hashes up reception. Now let's give it a quick once-over and call it a day. Okay, first, the FM wave is generated or formed at the transmitter by one of several methods. The simplest, the one we showed in this picture, was by means of a capacitor mic. This capacitor mic, you remember, increased or decreased in capacitance according to the sound that hit it. Increasing or decreasing the capacitance of the mic affected the frequency of the oscillator. The two army methods of getting FM are reactance tube and phase modulation. But no matter what method is used, the FM wave is radiated by the transmitting antenna. The receiving antenna picks it up, it's amplified, and then fed into the device called the limiter. The limiter clips off any amplitude modulations that would come out of the speaker as noise. From the limiter, the now cleaned up wave is fed into the discriminator. This device changes frequency variations back into audio voltage variations. From there, it's into the amplifier and out of the speaker. So, briefly and simply, you've seen the how, why, and what of frequency modulation. Electrical disturbances don't bother FM as far as the static they cause is concerned. When frequency modulation is used, you can be sure that electrical interference won't hash up your messages.
They're actually a sort of invisible energy. This aerial can actually pick up enough of this energy to power this primitive receiver I made. It has no battery. It relies entirely on harnessing the energy of the radio waves in the air. It's not very loud, so I'll have to put it straight on the microphone so you can hear it. I managed to pick up Radio Israel broadcasting from Jerusalem on it one night. Although there's something quite wonderful about this little thing, radio sets have been around for so long now that they've become rather ordinary, unglamorous contraptions, and even the electronics inside now look rather familiar. In this program, I'm going to look at how these mysterious radio waves were discovered and how radio receivers managed to pick them up. Creating radio waves is actually very simple. Any electric spark emits them. Each of these sparks is sending out radio waves. You hear them on the radio as interference. That's why lightning makes radios crackle, and even the tiny spark inside a light switch is enough to produce a little pop. But without a radio set, though, it's not easy to detect these waves, and most scientists didn't believe they existed till just over 100 years ago. What finally convinced them was an experiment performed by the physicist Heinrich Hertz in 1887. It was first demonstrated in Britain by a scientist called Oliver Lodge, here in the Royal Institution. Hertz used very big sparks created by a machine like this called an induction coil. Could you turn it on, Bill? This was connected to these metal plates with another spark gap in the middle, and this acted as a sort of aerial. This was Hertz's receiver. It's simply a loop of copper wire. Well, the big spark creates radio waves with enough energy to make a tiny spark jump across the gap between these balls in the receiver when they're held very close together. So, if I hold these in position. Okay, Bill. If you look carefully, you can just see the spark jumping across the gap. These sparks are so tiny that Hertz had to let his eyes get accustomed to the dark for 15 minutes and then watch the sparks through a magnifying glass. His apparatus only had a range of a few meters, and he had no interest in finding any practical uses for it. The first person to use radio waves for signalling was Guglielmo Marconi. Marconi had been a difficult child. His mother was a Jameson from the Irish whiskey distillers who'd run away to Italy to be an opera singer and married an Italian landowner. She quickly got bored on his estate.
There's not much going on here. I think we'll go for a little jaunt.
The infant Marconi spent much of his childhood being dragged round Europe by his mother.
Where are we going, Mama? Barcelona, or perhaps Boulogne. Yatte colorati, la 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 la, eccolo eccolo lì, la 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 la.
He showed little interest at school and constantly irritated his father with ridiculous scientific experiments.
Cos'è? Eccoci. Eccola.
Prego my plate, smash your face.
Shortly after failing to get into university, he happened to read an article about Hertz's work.
Oh!
He immediately started obsessively experimenting and had soon managed to transmit the signals over a mile. Still aged only 20, he arrived in England to try and sell his ideas. Marconi had found that fixing one side of the spark gap to a long vertical wire made a much better aerial than Hertz's. This was further improved by connecting the other side of the spark gap to Earth. Apart from that, the transmitter was basically the same as Hertz's. Any electrical spark will do. Here it's being provided by the ignition circuit of Rex's pickup truck. This primitive transmitter has a surprisingly long range. Marconi also used a much more sensitive receiver called a coherer. This was based on a design by Oliver Lodge. This is my homemade version. It's just a tube of nickel filings. I made it by filing down a coin. You fix one end to the aerial, another kite, and the other end to the Earth. And what happens is that when it detects the radio waves, its electrical resistance falls dramatically, so it acts as a sort of switch and turns on a circuit. The theory behind it's very complicated and wasn't worked out till many years later, but it's quite simple to make it work. The only slightly complicated thing is that you have to have something to shake it to restore its high resistance at the end of each signal. So now if I signal to Rex, This is Marconi's original equipment that he brought to England with him. This is his transmitter with an induction coil like Hertz's, and these balls that concentrated the energy of the spark. One end would have been connected to the aerial. This is his receiver. The aerial went on here. This is his coherer inside the glass tube. The filings are actually in the gap in the middle. And this is the device to tap it. Marconi would have been sending a combination of long pulses and short pulses, sending messages in Morse code. Well, this original apparatus only had a range of about 3 miles, but Marconi gradually increased the sensitivity of his coherers and the size of his transmitters till he was sending messages hundreds of miles. The larger transmitters had much larger spark gaps, which got very noisy, so he had to take to putting them in enclosed boxes. Marconi's early systems had a big disadvantage. They couldn't be tuned. You can hear the signal from our spark transmitter all across the short, medium and long wave bands. The reason is that sparks create chaotic waves of all sorts of different wavelengths. What was needed was a more precise transmitter than a spark. This was the solution, the tuned circuit. It suddenly all starts to look like a proper radio, but the basic parts are still quite simple. There's a coil of wire here called an inductor, and a series of overlapping metal plates here called a capacitor. The electricity whizzes backwards and forwards from one to the other, oscillating thousands of times a second. The valve acts as a sort of pump, keeping the whole thing going. You can see a picture of the radio waves this tuned circuit's transmitting on this oscilloscope that I've hooked up to a short aerial. If I hold it near the tuned circuit and switch on, you can see how regular the oscillations or waves that it's transmitting are. Now, if I compare this with the spark machine, you can see just how chaotic its radio waves are. Once the tuned transmitter had been perfected, spark transmitters were quickly banned for polluting the airwaves. With the problem of interference solved, radio seemed so miraculous that it could be capable of almost anything. Early radios did still have one limitation. They couldn't transmit speech, only the simple pulses of Morse code. Morse code still used for messages on the shortwave band, and pulse codes are also used for radio-controlled models.
I built this little car for a children's television series, and I've hooked up the oscilloscope to the transmitter so you can actually see the stream of pulses that the car receives. If I work this switch, that's the one that works the headlights, you can see it just moves one pulse. If I shift that one, it works 2 pulses, which actually opens the door. This one works the steering from left to right, you see it's moving 4 pulses. This one is shifting 5 pulses, and that's the speed control for forwards and backwards control, and so forth. Each series of pulses work a different function inside the car. To transmit speech and music instead of simple pulses, you first have to convert the sound to an electrical signal with a microphone and then combine it with the radio waves. In the radio receiver, it all gets separated out again. You can see this very clearly on an oscilloscope. If I turn on this little radio, and I now plug the oscilloscope in to the loudspeaker, it's a bit large, this is giving a picture of the sound signal and you can see it roughly matches the sound that's coming out of the loudspeaker. Now if I plug it in further back on the circuit, this is the sound signal combined with the radio waves. You can see the peaks still roughly match the sound that it's making, and the radio waves are actually going rapidly up and down in the middle. Now if I stretch this out a bit, these are the actual radio waves, and you can see what's happening is that the sound is constantly changing their size or their amplitude. And that's why this is called amplitude modulation, or AM radio.
The man who designed much of the practical circuitry for AM radio was an American called Edwin Howard Armstrong. While in France during World War I, he invented the superhet circuit, which has been used ever since. He then sold a patent to RCA back in America.
I have an appointment to see Mr. Sarnoff.
Oh, Mrs. Sarnoff's expecting you, Mr. Armstrong.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
He became a millionaire overnight and fell in love with the chairman's secretary.
How about you come for a spin in my motor?
Okay.
Hop in there.
Oh, it sure is a big one.
He bought a huge Hispano Suiza and climbed his tallest aerial to impress her. They were married soon afterwards.
Will you marry me? Oh, Howard, my hero.
The fundamental principles of radio have remained unchanged. This is the BBC transmitter at Brookman's Park, broadcasting medium-wave radio to southeast England.
Inside, the engineers have restored the BBC's very first transmitter, built by the Marconi Company in about 1920. This end of it actually creates the radio waves, and this end of it combines them with the sound signal, the amplitude modulation. It's basically a series of giant tuned circuits with the valves, the coils of wire of the inductors, and the overlapping metal plates of the capacitors. Well, this generates about 2 kilowatts. This may sound a lot, but this modern transmitter is rated 150 kilowatts, and it's all much more sophisticated. This one's actually broadcasting Radio 3 on AM all over southeast England. Inside, though, the basic components are still remarkably similar. The inductors have remained exactly the same, and the valves and capacitors, although they're now more enclosed, still work on the same principles as well.
Transmitters like these broadcasting sound first appeared in World War I. They were used for sending messages by radio telephony. Broadcasting radio to entertain people was first started after the war by enthusiastic Marconi engineers. The BBC was then set up by the government in 1922, and listening to the radio rapidly became very popular. At first, most listeners had very simple receivers, crystal sets like the Rexophone. They needed enormous aerials because, like my radio at the start of the programme, they had no battery and relied entirely on the energy of the radio waves in the air.
Looked back on the literature they'd been taught in these academic institutions, they found it wasn't really their literature.
It's easier to see how they worked on this homemade version. Instead of a coherer, it has a lump of crystal and a fine wire called the cat's whisker. Electricity will only flow one way through the contact between the wire and the crystal, and this has the effect of separating out the sound from the radio waves.
Like the coherer, the theory behind the cat's whisker is very complicated, but it's quite simple to make it work. The imperfect contact between teeth and fillings can occasionally have the same effect, causing a few unfortunate people to hear the radio inside their head all the time. This is the modern equivalent of the cat's whisker, the germanium diode. If I put it under a magnifying glass, you can see it's an enclosed version of the same thing. You can see the whisker just touching the lump of germanium.
The primitive radio I had at the beginning of the programme worked with one of these, and in fact most modern transistor radios still use them as well.
Much of the radio set's evolution has been preserved by Gerald Wells at the Vintage Wireless Museum.
If you wanted something better than a crystal set, what sort of thing would you have had?
Well, you could have had something like this, which is 3 separate units, hence it was called a wireless or radio set, because it was a set of parts. It would have consisted of a tune circuit, an RF amplifier, a detector stage, and a power output stage. And that would have got you most of the local stations with earphones or a modest loudspeaker.
What happened after that was the next stage?
Well, the next stage, they decided to stick it all in one box to make it less wires and make it neater. This was a bit more elaborate as well. More stations were coming onto the airwaves, so more elaborate tuning was needed. So they brought in series parallel switching for your aerials and tune circuits, variable condenser and reaction condenser, an RF stage to amplify the signal, a detector stage to take the place of the old-fashioned cat's whisker, and 2 stages of LF amplification. That would be quite an elaborate set, but you could, by moving these bars around, do away with those stages and listen with earphones on there and save a lot of battery power.
Oh, I see. When did they start enclosing all the working parts of the radios?
Well, certainly by the mid-20s, when they decided that this wasn't really very nice in the living room, and so they started building it into familiar objects, like the medicine chest, for instance, where it could be easily disguised, and that wouldn't disgrace any respectable home.
What other shapes?
Well, the most famous of all, of course, is the smoker's cabinet. Every home had a smoker's cabinet. You'd have your pipe racks and the bits at the top. Smoking was big industry. You'd have your drawer at the bottom, where you'd have your pipe cleaners, your matches and your tobacco, and it would all fold away and look quite innocent. It didn't scream wireless at you.
Of course, all these early radios were powered by batteries, weren't they?
Well, yes, there was very little electricity around, and the early radios required a 2-volt accumulator, sometimes 4 or 6, but usually 2, which had to be charged up every week, so that meant you had 2 of them, one being charged, one in use, and you'd need a high-tension battery, you'd need a grid bias battery. The grid bias battery lasted about a year and cost 9p. That would last about 3 months and cost you 7 and 6p.
So it was all quite expensive then?
It was an expensive business, and it took a lot of rigging up. You had to have an elaborate aerial and earth system, and all the bother of getting your accumulator charged every week. Admitted it was only threepence and reasonably cheap, but it did mean you had to be careful. You had about 20 hours listening a week. So that when you went to your radio shop, there was usually a Radio Times provided on the counter. That saved you buying one. And with the aid of their Bakelite fountain pen and a pad, you could make notes of what was worth listening to during the following week. So you could pick your programmes and plan your meals around the wireless set. You didn't just hear it, you actually sat down and listened to it and gave it all your attention. You had to, it cost you so much to rig up. And of course, when you came in with your accumulator every week, there was all the other old tabbers and rat bags in there changing the accumulators as well, and you would discuss the programmes. So the reputation of wireless programmes was made and lost in a wireless shop.
By the 30s, the appearance of radios had started to change dramatically with the introduction of the new material Bakelite. Pioneered in Britain by the Echo Company, this could be moulded to almost any shape. Its one drawback was that it was easily breakable.
See these 2 portable radios? Well, watch this. Let her go, Betsy. Sorry, friend, you old-style portables have to go. But look at our new RCA Victor portable radio. Came through without a chip. RCA Victor's non-breakable impact case means no chipping, no cracking, no breaking. And hear that tone. It's RCA Victor's great golden throat sound. See the world's only portables with the non-breakable impact case as low as $27.95 at your RCA Victor dealers.
The biggest change in broadcast radio since the war has been the introduction of FM. The great advantage is that it's much less susceptible to interference. The spark, which drowns out AM radio, is
hardly audible on FM.
Mrs. Thatcher, why she had used the phrase guerrilla warfare? Because there are...
FM stands for frequency modulation. The principle behind it is really quite simple. Instead of the sound altering the amplitude of the radio waves, as in AM, it alters their frequency.
FM radio was yet another invention of Howard Armstrong. He started work in the early 30s with a missionary zeal to produce true hi-fi radio. After encouraging tests with RCA, the company suddenly pulled out.
Sarnoff! Well, why have you cancelled my project?
Ah, get off my back. We never promised
radio
you
is
nothing.
the
We're
thing
into
of the
TV
future.
now.
When FM radio was becoming established, Armstrong and RCA started a lengthy battle over the patents.
You have stolen my ideas. You did not. I was the inventor. Certainly not. How can
This had a disastrous effect on his health and on his marriage.
I've had such a terrible day.
By the way, I'm leaving.
This is the last straw. I can't take any more.
FM has now become firmly established and is invaluable for radio communications as well as for broadcasting.
When I fly my little aircraft, I use radio. I personally wouldn't fly without one. This enables me to keep in touch with air traffic control and other air users, and also airfields, and tell them of your intentions. And if you do happen to get lost, air traffic control can help you find your way. And it also is a navigational radio. I can tune in to various fixed beacons throughout the country, and I can fly directly to and from these beacons. And that helps immensely to find your way around the country.
Domestic radios have also become much more sophisticated. Many now have automatic push-button tuning, and the sound quality can be very impressive, particularly in stereo FM. But despite this improvement, radio has really been eclipsed by television and other modern marvels, and radio sets aren't the important prized possessions they once were. In fact, the whole idea of a separate radio set is rather disappearing. Radios now tend to be combined with cassette tape recorders or alarm clocks or hi-fi systems. Radio is so taken for granted today, it's hard to think of it as magical anymore, but I hope in this programme I've managed to persuade
To understand the fundamental principles of the antenna on either fixed or aircraft installations, it is first necessary to have a conception of how radio waves are generated and how they behave. If we hold a compass near a wire through which a direct current of electricity is passed, it will be deflected. A magnetic field exists around the wire as long as the current continues to flow. Lines of force are created around the conductor whenever the flow of current stops. The direction of these lines of force, making up the magnetic field, changes whenever the direction of current flow is changed. If we charge a glass rod by friction, it will attract objects from a distance. This is static electricity. Around the charged object, lines of force extend out at right angles from the surface. In this case, the field is not magnetic. It is a dielectric field. This field remains around the object as long as it remains charged. Thus we see that electricity flowing as a direct current generates a magnetic field, while around a charged object in which there is no flow of current, there is a dielectric field, sometimes called an electrostatic field. In a hookup consisting of a battery, switch, and condenser, maximum current flows the instant the switch is closed, resulting in the creation of a magnet at the instant of closing the circuit. This magnetic field remains around the conductor and condenser closed. When the plates of the condenser are fully charged, current ceases to flow. The magnetic field around the condenser and conductors collapses as current diminishes. The condenser is then a charged object, and a dielectric field is built up around it as the charge accumulates. If the battery is reversed, the dielectric field collapses. The energy returns to the circuit and then builds up in the opposite direction. Rapid changes in polarity in the circuit result in rapidly changing dielectric and magnetic fields. If the condenser plates in such a circuit are moved apart, the dielectric and magnetic fields move out to distances. When the polarity of the battery is reversed, the field collapses and is built up in the opposite direction. Both fields are projected out and return at the speed of light, 186,300 miles per second. Very rapid changes in polarity are possible if a high-frequency generator is used. When the polarity of the system is suddenly changed, the field which has been built up starts to return to the circuit. However, the reversal in polarity starts another electromagnetic field moving outward. This new field, or wave of energy, meets the first one before it has had time to return to its source. The returning energy in each case, meeting the oncoming new field, is forced out as an electromagnetic wave. When each new field starts to collapse, it meets another surge of energy and is driven out as another wave. With a radio tube as oscillator, a rapid continuous series of waves results. These are radio waves. Radio waves move in all directions from the radiating source or antenna, traveling at the speed of light. All radio waves move at the same velocity. Low-frequency transmission results in long wavelengths. The more rapidly the waves follow each other, the higher the frequency. The higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength. Radio waves tend to travel in a straight line, much as does light. They may be reflected or refracted. An example of reflection is seen near an antenna, where the earth is the reflecting medium. The refracting media are layers of ionized gas in a region from 50 to 300 miles above the earth. In this region, known as the ionosphere, the layers of ionized atmosphere so bend radio waves that they act as if they had been reflected. An upper angle or sky wave may thus be returned to the earth at a great distance, where it may be heard with good volume. The sky wave returning from the ionosphere may be reflected by the earth, going into the upper atmosphere again, where it is refracted back toward the earth a second time. This refraction and reflection may be repeated several times, so that a message may often be heard thousands of miles from the transmitting station. The higher frequencies are refracted the least, some extremely short waves failing to return to the Earth at all. This low refractive index of the medium-high frequencies makes them desirable for long-distance communication. Antenna installations are often adapted to the particular characteristics of these high frequencies. That portion of the antenna's radiation traveling near the surface of the Earth is called the ground wave. The polarization of this ground wave changes as it travels, tending to lean forward. The ground wave loses energy. Accordingly, it cannot be used for long-distance communication. The ground wave of the lower frequencies travels farther than do the higher frequencies. Extremely high frequencies act almost as does light, failing to follow the Earth's curvature or to go around obstacles. In many cases, a silent strip exists between the point where the skywave returns to Earth and where the ground wave has become or too weak to be detected. This is known as the skip distance or zone of silence. There may be more than one skip distance when the wave is reflected into the sky from where it is returned and reflected again. For example, a powerful station in Cincinnati may not be heard in St. Louis. Yet beyond a zone of silence, it comes in clearly at Kansas City. Beyond a second zone of silence, the station may again be heard in Denver. Fading may be due to changes in the ionosphere level. This shifts the position of the returned skywave. The signal is heard when it is returned to the receiving station and fades out when it misses the station. Fading is often due to interference effects between the ground wave and the returned sky wave. The two waves strengthen each other when in phase. When out of phase, they weaken or destroy the signal altogether. Distortion as well as fading may be due to this interference effect between waves, both of which are from the same station. Space about is filled with unseen waves, sent from many antennae. Out of the maze, an efficient receiver and antenna will select but one, translating it into an intelligible message.
Great towers, Army, 12583. Traffic at 2000. Suspect tower went over field for landing instructions. That is all.
On the subatomic level, I feel that there is a dimension shift activated by very conventional electrostatics, RF fields that I use, and Tesla waves that I use, that actually form a keyway that opens up another area of time and space that may activate the zero-point energy fields and interdimensional reactions, let's say, to gravitational waves and time waves, or chronons, if you wish. Perhaps we're dealing in chronons and gravitons, which are maybe particles, and somehow causing a distortion, which causes objects to become weightless, or to simply break apart or pulsate in the center of stainless steel bars and fall apart, or cause samples to turn transparent. Is one theory. There's many different theories, of course, from various scientists around the world that get into deep mathematics, but I like to think on the simplistic side and visualize exactly what is going on instead of using math. This kind of power, of course, coupled properly, produce these effects on the order of terawatts. It would take terawatts to cause these kind of effects by conventional means, to rip apart stainless steel bars and reduce stainless steel and other metals to rubble, cause buildings to disappear, which apparently did happen, witnessed by an insurance agent and other witnesses. There's quite a host of different effects over the years that did take place, and on the outside too, such as shaking of telephone poles, which is well known, and even creation of thunder clouds above the laboratory. So we're dealing in a free energy situation where all the RF power, all electrical power, or a pure lightning bolt couldn't create the effects of ripping apart these pieces of metal and causing things to float in the air like they do. This demonstration here of the objects vibrating was caused actually by self-resonation of what they call ferromagnetic and piezo electric and ferromagnetic barium titanate. And this was used in the Army for levitation experiments. And this particular experiment here is showing a crude form of levitation that causes heavy objects with 7 pounds here to move around on a piece of aluminum plate through self-resonance, which is many bands and frequencies that I was causing. And other objects tend to move around, but only on translational movements. Basically, I'm doing a self-resonation system and adding onto it different carriers through the top amplifier, and tuning in, broadening the frequencies, the pulse rate, and that causing it to react in different shapes. So almost controllable translational movements. There's really no difference on the surrounding materials from the main cylinder. It can be plastic, steel, or very heavy objects will tend to slide around a bit. And yet, if you suspend a ring above the barium cylinder, you notice that the ring is held by some type the ring is held by some type of invisible force. So the applications of this in advanced applications using free energy or zero-point energy to power it would be in propulsion technologies. And that would be applicable to the forces that this type of material puts out.